All right, so here's my latest project. This is a 1968 El Camino. It's a resto mod. Great paint job, excellent body, great engine bay and components. It's got a 327 in here with a mild cam. Really nice 3-speed transmission. Engine was done nice, has air conditioning, dual electric fans. Beautiful car. Everything's great. Stripes are painted on with a clear coat over it. You can't even feel the edges. Everything's really nice. Even the bed's nice. The inside looked nice as well. And this is where this video story really begins. And let me explain. So initially, the dash needed a new speedometer. You can see it's missing the needle. How that happens, I have no idea because I didn't even see the remnants of it. But I already knew that buying the car. Easy on El Caminos for this year to take out the instrument cluster. So I did that to replace the speedometer when I got the new speedometer. And it's sitting right here. And I want to go ahead and took out the dash. I wasn't going to make a video of it because it's so simplistic. But it's turning into this video. And this is where the nightmare begins. Some things that you don't see when you're buying a car. Okay, so let's get down to what the crux of this video is about. These are the things that you don't see when you're inspecting a car because they're hidden behind the dash. So I didn't intend to make this video because all this needed was a replacement speedometer. And so I already have the dash apart, and I decided to make the video when I saw the atrociousness of what was behind the cluster, the gauge cluster. So that's the start of this video. I'll show you how to take this dash out when I work in reverse and put it all back together. But in a short little nutshell here, there are 4 screws that hold the bottom part of this that's underneath the steering column. You take the 4 screws out holding this piece, and there are 2 nuts that hold the steering column, that keep the steering column up. So taking those nuts out allows the steering column to fall, and so that will give you more room to take the dash out. This is true also of the 68 Camaro that you saw, or that you might want to see another video on that I have when I was working on that, replacing the steering column. Same thing. You bring the column down and you let the column drop, and basically the dash comes out really easy. As far as the dash itself, the cluster, there's a few screws on the bottom on the left-hand side, and there's a few screws on the bottom on the right-hand side, and then there's screws on the top. So big red flag to me should have been there was only 4 screws holding this whole thing together. The others were missing. So not a good sign. So anyways, took the cluster out, and that's when the haunting piece of this whole thing, the atrociousness, the laziness, the absolute amateurishness to it. And I normally don't really rag on people about stuff like that, you know, especially when people work on their own cars, but this was just absolutely atrocious. Here's some examples. A ton of zip ties holding wires together, and they weren't cut. They weren't cut to length. So all the excess zip ties were just all over the place for stuff that was just zip tied together, just to maintain some sense of organization, I suppose, or tidying things up, but it wasn't tidying things up at all. Then there's all these wires that led to nowhere. They were just zip tied, but they weren't connected to anything on either end. So that was absolutely crazy to me. What else did we find in there? The top duct there was just hanging. I put it back in place, but it was just hanging there. The reason is they zip tied the wiring harnesses to the ducts, and of course the weight of them. First of all, the zip tie being so tight crushed the ducts, and then the weight of the harnesses just brought the ducts down and just unhooked them from, the ends, where the vents is. So that was absolutely nuts. The other thing I found is when I took the dash and slid it out, that this little piece there, that's where the ignition goes into. Well, on the Chevelle and on the El Camino here, that bezel is just a bezel. It's not intended to hold the ignition in place. There is a sleeve nut that actually holds the ignition in place, and then the bevel slides over it. And I'll show you this when I get the replacement parts. They glued this bevel onto this dash, and it's just a mess. So when I pulled this out, the whole ignition came popping out at the back side. So it's just barely hanging in there. So rather than trying to fix this dash and grind this out and everything like that, I ordered a new dash. This dash is by Autometer. It came with the gauge cluster. It's about a $480 piece. So anyways, rather than trying to fix this, I just went ahead and made the sacrifice of just ordering a new one that's on its way. So there's some things. It gets even worse though. So let me show you what other stuff is here. So hopefully it'll help you in your travels of when you're putting things in place. Okay. So what other surprises do we have here? So the other thing here is this had a mechanical oil pressure gauge. Well, the mechanical oil pressure gauge has where if I can find it here, a nylon tube that carries the oil. You can see part of it right here, as a matter of fact. So you can see there's some oil in it. So that goes to the engine block, and so obviously there's oil pushing through that nylon tubing to the gauge. Well, the problem is that nylon tube is all entangled inside the wiring harnesses. Not a good thing. So I'm going to untangle all of that nylon tubing and make sure I have a straight run to the gauge. So that's the other thing. Another tip, don't do this. What I'm going to show you next. These wire twist things, holding the wires together, solder stuff and shrink, and use heat shrink. Or use, if you're going to use crimp connectors, fine, use crimp connectors, but don't use these things. These things will just pop off. Your wiring will be exposed. Oh, and speaking of exposed wiring, let's take a look at the ignition that popped out here. So this is the harness to the ignition because I took the ignition out. So look, bare wires hanging out of the ignition. Not only that, this red wire you see here, it was actually wrapped around one of the spades that plugs into the harness plug. Crazy stuff. So some of the things that you don't want to do, we're done here. So it's a good lesson in what not to do. Look, this is the old wiring harness. So the old cluster would have had wires go, to a board behind it. But since the gauge cluster was replaced with all these mechanical gauges, they didn't need a lot of the wires. But what did they do? They cut the wires from the harness and just left them dangling. They didn't terminate them, nothing. They're just dangling there. Then there's wires in here that just go to nowhere. Some of the wires here, this purple and brown wire, they don't go anywhere. They're just ends that are just, like I said, they're not connected to anything. So, anyways, this is going to be a joy. Basically, rewiring and just tidying this all up. So the only other thing we have to do to take this dash out is I have a mechanical water temperature gauge here. This is a sealed unit. You don't want to take this out if you're going to take this dash out and take the gauge off. This goes all the way to the manifold. So you're going to have to unhook it or unscrew it from the manifold and then guide this whole thing through the firewall in order to take this out, because it's a sealed unit. This does not come out. If you try to take this out, you will damage the meter. So you have to basically go all the way, and you don't want to kink the copper. It has a sheath on it, but this is copper tubing that's there that goes all the way to the firewall. If you kink or crack that, you'll hear a little psh sound. Not good. You're going to have to replace the whole thing, the gauge and that tubing is all sealed, all connected, all one piece. So you want to be careful with the temperature gauge, because that's the one sensitive part to this whole thing, and taking this out and replacing the whole dash. All right, so I think that's it for now. One last thing, this is a tip if you're using LED lights. So I found the two ballasts for the headlights. They put LED lights in for the headlights, and they're in the front. But here's the thing, the turn signals on this didn't work. And the reason being is they had the right flash relay. If you're using a stock flash relay, and that's what it's usually a silver can. In this case, I can tell that they replaced it. So that's what that cylinder thing is. So what happens is, it's what goes on and off when you hear a tick, 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 tick with your turn signals. That's that relay. So what's happening is the LED lights on the brakes, on the rear tail lights here, one of the LED lights was not functioning properly, and so that's what caused the LED lights the turn signals not to work. I replaced the two LEDs in the back though with the incandescent, the stock bulbs that would have been there, and now everything works. If you are putting LED lights in your tail lights, you need to replace your stock relay, because if you don't, they won't work, because there's not enough load. The LEDs don't give enough load for the relay to understand that that there's voltage going to the LEDs. So you're going to have to replace it. If you're putting LED lights and their turn signals don't work, that could be a good reason why. You got to replace your flasher. These newer flashers will detect a smaller load, and they will work properly. All right. So I hope I didn't ramble too much with that. So there you go. That's just a tip if you're going to use LED taillights and your turn signals don't work. All right. So we're going to, the other thing is this didn't come with a glove compartment. So I'll probably find a glove compartment or 3D print one, and we'll deal with that as well. All right. I should have checked the glove compartment when I bought the car, and I would have seen the rest of the mess behind it, behind the dash. All right, so I think that's it for now. Stay tuned. I'll show you some of the progress that I make in replacing the dash itself, and then how to put it back in, and yeah. So isn't this going to be fun? All right, stay tuned. We'll be back.